They found him sleeping in the empty horse trough behind the church, and not one soul in that town lifted a hand to help, because the people who threw a grown man out into the cold were the same people everybody trusted. His own wife's family. They told the town he was a drunk, a leech, a man who'd driven their daughter into an early grave. And the town believed it, the way towns always believe the loudest voice in the room. But there was one woman who knew the truth, a woman most of them wouldn't even look in the eye. She had been waiting almost a full year, not because she was afraid, but because she was patient. And on the morning she finally walked up the main street of that town, holding a folded paper against her chest, she was about to say the 7 words that would take everything the Ashford family had built on a lie and burn it down to the ground. I was there, I saw all of it, and I've never been able to tell it right, not once in all these years, so let me try now while I still can. Stay with me, because what she revealed on that porch is going to sit in your chest long after this story ends. The first time I saw Elias Crane after they threw him off his own land, he was counting fence posts that weren't his to count anymore. I want you to understand how strange that was. A man loses his wife, loses his home, loses the good opinion of every person he's ever shaken hands with. And there, he is at the edge of the wintergrass fence line at first light, walking it slow, touching the top of each post with 2 fingers like he was taking a pulse. I sat my horse on the road and watched him do it for the better part of a quarter hour before he noticed me. I keep a tally book, always have. Little leather thing my father gave me, and I write down the count of everything: head of cattle, sacks of feed, days without rain, the price of nails when the price of nails goes up, which it always does. My late wife used to say I'd count the stars if the good Lord would hold still long enough. So I understood, in a way most folks wouldn't, what Elias was doing out there. He was counting because counting is the one thing a man can hold on to when everything else has come loose in his hands. Numbers don't lie to you. Numbers don't stand on a porch and tell the whole town you killed your own wife. "Morning, Elias," I said. He turned. Lord, he looked 10 years older than the spring before. Elias Crane had come into our part of the country maybe 6 years prior, a lean, quiet man with good hands and a way of gentling a spooked horse that I'd have paid money to learn. He'd married Della Ashford inside of a year, and the 2 of them had built the Wintergrass place up from a rundown homestead nobody else wanted into 40 acres of the best-kept grays in the county. I'd been a neighbor to that. I'd watched them raise the barn. I'd eaten Della's cornbread at their table more times than I could count, and I count everything. Now his coat was gone at both elbows, and there was a smell coming off him. Not liquor, whatever the Ashfords said, but the plain animal smell of a man who's been sleeping rough and hasn't had a fire big enough to boil water. "Hal," he said, just that. Then he looked back at the fence like he'd lost his place and had to find the post he'd been touching. "You eat." He didn't answer that, which was an answer. I'll tell you what I should have done. I should have gotten down off my horse and taken that man by the arm and brought him home and set him at my own table and let the whole town of Red Hawk Bend go straight to blazes with its opinions. That's what a good neighbor does. That's what I'd like to believe I'd do today. Instead, I sat there, because I was a coward, and because Cornelius Ashford held the paper on my second mortgage, and a man can talk himself into all manner of quiet cruelties when there's a note due in the fall. "They can't just take it," I said, gesturing at the land. "There's law." Elias laughed. It was a terrible sound, dry as a creek bed in August. "Law." He touched the next post. "Deeds in Della's name, Hal. Always was. Cornelius put it that way when we married, said it protected her. Said a woman ought to have something of her own in case her husband turned out to be no good." He said the last 3 words in a voice that wasn't his own, and I understood he was quoting his father-in-law, word for word, from some conversation he'd been chewing on for months. "When she passed, it went to next of kin. That's them, not me. I'm not blood. You were her husband. Turns out that's not the same thing to a lawyer." He finally stopped walking, stood there with his hand flat against the last post at the corner where the wire turned toward the creek, and for a second I thought he might go down. He didn't. He just breathed. "I built this fence," he said. "Every post. Della held them plumb while I tamped the dirt. She's the one who said we should run it straight down to the water so the stock could drink without me having to haul it." He took his hand off the post like it had gone hot. "I keep coming out here. I don't know why. I keep thinking if I count them all, if I get the number right, something'll come loose and I'll wake up." "How many?" I said, because I didn't know what else to give him, and because I thought maybe the number was the only thing he had left to be proud of. He looked at me, and for the first time something like a real man came back up into his eyes. 211, he said. "Down to the creek and back. 211 posts, and I set every one of them true. I wrote it in my tally book. I don't know why, I still have it. 211 in pencil, going faint now. You'll want to know how it happened. How a man goes from 40 good acres to a horse trough behind a church in the space of one winter. I'll tell you the way the town told it first, and then I'll tell you the way it was, because those were two different stories, and the gap between them is the whole of what this is about. The town story went like this. Della Crane took sick in the fall, a fever that settled in her lungs and wouldn't lift. Her mother and father, Cornelius and Vesta Ashford, being wealthy folk with a fine house in town and a stake in the freight line and half the paper in the county, brought a real doctor up from the territorial capital, spared no expense. But Della died anyway, 3 days before Christmas, 26 years old. And in their grief the Ashfords let it be known, never quite out loud, always in that porch and parlor way that travels faster than a telegraph, that the girl had worked herself to death on that hard-luck ranch, that Elias had been too poor and too proud to bring her to town where she'd have been warm and safe, that he'd let their only daughter waste away for the sake of his stubborn pride and his 40 acres of dirt. And the town believed it, the way I told you. Because the Ashfords had money and manners and a pew near the front, and Elias had calloused hands and a way of not looking at people when they talked, which folks mistook for guilt when it was only ever grief. Now here is the way it was. I know because Della told me, 3 weeks before she died, sitting up in her bed with a shawl around her shoulders, and her hands wrapped around a cup of something a woman named Mara had brewed for her cough. Della was dying because she wanted to, not in the way that a person throws themselves off a bridge. In the quieter, more stubborn way, she had a fever that a stronger person might have thrown off, but Della had been sick a long time before the fever, sick in a way no doctor from the capital could touch, and she was tired. She told me so. She said, "Hal, I'm so tired, and Elias won't let me be tired. He keeps fighting for me, and I don't have the heart to tell him I've stopped fighting for myself." She'd lost a child that spring, did you know that? The town didn't. A baby that came too early and lived a day and a half, and it had taken something out of Della that never came back. And Elias, God love him, had done everything a man could do. Sat up nights. Sold his best saddle horse to pay for the doctor the Ashfords always claimed they'd paid for themselves. Carried her out to see the sunrise when she said she missed it. He was not the villain in her death. He was the last person on this earth who refused to give her up. The doctor from the capital came exactly once, stayed 2 hours, took Cornelius Ashford's money and left. Della never even liked him. He looked at me like I was a sum that wouldn't add up, she said. And then she said the thing I've never forgot, the thing that comes back to me at odd hours. The only one who tells me the truth is Mara. Everyone else keeps lying about how I'm getting better. Mara just holds my hand and tells me it's all right to be scared. That was the first time I heard the woman's name. Let me tell you about Mara, or at least what I knew of her then, which wasn't much and most of it wrong. She lived out past the eastern edge of town in a low adobe house that had been there longer than Red Hawk Bend had a name. Apache. The town said Apache the way it said drought, like a thing to be endured. She'd nursed sick folks in that country for 30 years, brought half the bobbies in the county safe into the world, set bones, drawn out fevers, and been paid for it in eggs and cast-off clothes and more often in nothing at all. The same women whose children she'd delivered would cross the street to keep from walking in her shadow. The same men who'd fetched her at midnight when their wives were laboring would refuse to tip their hats to her in daylight. They didn't even call her by her right name. Mara was a name somebody in town had stuck on her years back. I don't know who, I don't know why, and it wasn't hers, and she knew it wasn't hers, and she answered to it anyway because it cost her less than correcting them would have. I only learned that much later, and it shamed me. All those years, and not one of us ever asked the woman what she'd have liked to be called. I tell you this so you'll understand what it meant, what she was about to do. A woman with every reason in the world to let that town rot in its own lies, a woman who owed Elias Crane nothing and owed the Ashfords less, was about to walk up the middle of the main street in broad daylight and stake her word against the richest family in the county. And she knew, the way you know the weather, exactly how much that would cost her and exactly how little it would gain her. She did it anyway. I'll get to why. There's a reason, and it's not the one you're thinking, and when I tell you, you'll understand why I've carried this story around like a stone in my boot for so many years. But first the trough. It was the second week of a cold, wet spring, the kind of wet that gets into the joints and stays, when word went around that Elias Crane had been found sleeping in the dry horse trough behind the Methodist church. He'd been drifting since the Ashfords put him off the land in January, working a day here and a day there, sleeping in barns when someone would look the other way, and this particular night he'd had nowhere at all, and the trough was out of the wind. Now you'd think a town might feel something at the sight of a grown man curled up in a horse trough, and some did, but the story had done its work by then. The story said he was a drunk, and a drunk in a trough is just a drunk where he belongs, and so mostly what the town felt was a kind of satisfied confirmation. There goes Crane, just like the Ashfords said. Some of the church women got up a collection to buy him a coach ticket out of the county, not out of charity, you understand, but to get him gone, the way you'd pay to have a dead animal hauled off before it turned. I heard about it at the mercantile, from Cornelius Ashford himself. He was standing at the counter in his good gray coat buying tobacco, and he said it loud enough for the whole store to hear. I always knew that man would end in a gutter. My wife saw it first. She said to Della on her wedding day, she said, that man will drag you down to his own level. And by God, he did. He shook his head, all sorrow, all Christian regret. We tried. We took her the finest doctor money could buy, but you can't save a woman from her own choice of husband. And the store murmured its agreement, and somebody said what a hard thing it must be for the Ashfords, and Vesta Ashford, she'd come in behind him, straight-backed. In black she was still wearing for a daughter dead over a year, dabbed her dry eyes with a handkerchief and said, "We only ever wanted our girl to be safe." I stood there by the nail barrel with my tally book in my pocket and my mortgage in Cornelius Ashford's desk, and I said nothing. I want you to know that I've never forgiven myself for the nothing I said that day. A man can be a coward in a single loud moment, but the worst kind of coward is the one who's quiet, over and over, in 100 small rooms. That was me. That was who I was. And then the door opened, and the little bell over it rang, and every head in that store turned, and the whole room went dead quiet all at once, the way a field goes quiet before weather. She'd come to town. Mara stood in the doorway with the gray morning light behind her and rain darkening the shoulders of her shawl, and she was not looking at the shelves, and she was not looking at the counter. She was looking straight at Cornelius Ashford, and in her two hands, held flat against her breast the way you'd hold something you'd carried a long way and meant to keep, was a folded piece of paper gone soft at the creases. Cornelius Ashford's face did a thing I'd never seen it do. It went white, not surprised white, not startled, afraid. In the half-second before he put his merchant smile back on, Cornelius Ashford looked at that folded paper in that woman's hands and he was afraid, and I saw it, and I was not the only one. "We don't serve," the man behind the counter started. "I didn't come to buy anything," Mara said. Her voice was low and even and carried to every corner of that store without her raising it at all. She had a way of talking, I'd learn, like a person laying stones in a wall one at a time, each one set true before she reached for the next. She never once took her eyes off Ashford. I came to bring back something that belongs to a man you threw away, and I came to say it in front of witnesses so it can't be buried twice. She let the quiet stretch, rain on the tin roof, somebody's boot creaking. The nail barrel I was leaning on suddenly seemed very loud when I so much as breathed. Della Crane didn't die the way you told it, Mara said, and I've got her own hand and her own words to prove it. Every soul in this room is going to hear what she wanted said, starting with you. And Cornelius Ashford, I swear this on whatever's left of my honor, Cornelius Ashford, the richest man in the county, took one step back and put his hand out and knocked a whole display of tinned peaches clattering across the floor, and did not even look down. You've never heard a store so quiet as the one Mara walked into that morning, and you've never heard one so loud as the one she walked back out of an hour later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set it down in order, the way it happened, because the order is where the truth lives. They didn't let her read it there in the mercantile. Cornelius Ashford got his color back fast, men like him always do, and he started in about how this was no place for the ravings of a woman who lived on herbs and superstition, and how she'd no doubt forged whatever paper she was waving, and how somebody ought to fetch the sheriff. And the store, God help it, started to turn back toward him. That's how it works. The loud voice reaches for the room and the room reaches back. But there was one thing Cornelius Ashford hadn't counted on, and that thing was me. I don't know what got into me. 20 years of counting things in a leather book, maybe, and then a woman walks in holding a number I couldn't make balance, and something in me that had been quiet a long time stood up. "I'll hear it," I said. My own voice surprised me. I said it again louder. "I'll hear it, every word, and I'll hear it somewhere the whole town can come, not tucked away where it can be called a lie later." I looked at Ashford and I thought about my mortgage in his desk, and I found I didn't much care. If it's a forgery, Cornelius, then you've got nothing to fear from folks hearing it, have you? Sunlight never yet hurt an honest man. You could have heard a pin drop on wet ground. And here's the thing about a town. The same fickle animal that will believe the loudest voice will also, just sometimes, follow the first person brave enough to ask for the truth. Somebody said, "I'll hear it too." Then somebody else. And within the quarter hour we were all of us walking up the muddy street toward the church, because it was the biggest room in Red Hawk Bend, and because some part of everyone wanted to be able to say later that they'd been there. They sent a boy running to fetch Elias from wherever he was, and they sent another to fetch the sheriff, and Cornelius Ashford let them, because he'd decided by then to brazen it out. And men like Cornelius Ashford have brazened their way out of so many rooms in their lives that they truly cannot imagine a room they can't. Elias came in last, hat in his hands, water dripping off him, looking at all of us like he'd walked into the wrong funeral. When he saw Mara standing up front by the pulpit rail with that paper in her hands, something crossed his face that I can only call dread, because he'd loved Della, and I think he was afraid. The way you're afraid of anything that might make the wound fresh, of hearing her name spoken aloud again. Mara waited until he'd sat. She'd have waited all day. She had that kind of patience, the patience of a person who has learned that the world will not hurry itself for her and has stopped asking it to. "Some of you," she began, "won't want to believe a word from me. That's your right. So I'm not going to ask you to believe me. I'm going to read you Della's own words that she spoke to me in the last week of her life, that I wrote down as she said them, and that she signed with her own hand while she could still hold the pen. 2 others saw her sign it. She named them a woman named Etta Foss who did washing, and old Pete Sandoval who dug the graves, 2 people so far beneath the Ashfords' notice that it had never occurred to Cornelius they might be watching. Both were in the church. Both stood when she named them and said yes. They'd seen it. They'd seen Della sign. Cornelius Ashford's jaw worked. He said nothing yet. And then Mara unfolded the paper, and she read, "I can't give you every word. I don't remember every word and I won't pretend to, because Della deserves better than a man's faulty memory dressed up as gospel. But I remember the shape of it, and I remember the three things that broke that room open, and I'll give you those." The first was about the land. Della's letter said, plain as morning, that the deed being in her name had never been her father's idea of protecting her. It had been her father's idea of owning her. Cornelius had put the Wintergrass deed in his daughter's name and then held a private note against it. A loan Della had never asked for, terms she'd never agreed to, drawn up so that the day anything happened to her, the land would revert not to her husband but to the man who held her paper, her own father. She'd found the second note by accident, going through her father's desk the last Christmas she was well, and she'd understood in that moment exactly what her marriage had been to Cornelius Ashford. Not a wedding, but an investment. A way to get a hardworking man to build up 40 worthless acres for free, and then to take them back the day the man was no longer useful. He was never going to let Elias keep it, the letter said, in Mara's steady voice. Not while I lived, and certainly not after. My father does not lose land. He only lends it back to you for a while, so you'll improve it before he takes it away. I heard a sound in the pews. It was the sound of a lot of people who owed Cornelius Ashford money doing arithmetic all at once. The second thing was about the doctor. The famous doctor from the capital, the one the Ashfords had spent a year telling the town they'd summoned out of the goodness of their grieving hearts. Della's letter said Cornelius had brought that doctor exactly once, and had brought him not to heal her but to witness her. To sign a paper attesting that she was of unsound mind, weakened, not competent to manage her own affairs, so that any wishes she might have set down, any will, any deed transfer, any gift to her husband could be thrown out later as the confusion of a dying woman. The doctor had taken Cornelius's money, looked at Della for 2 hours, and signed what he was paid to sign. He looked at me like a sum that wouldn't add up, the letter said, and I felt the floor go out from under me, because that was word for word what Della had told me in her bedroom 3 weeks before she died, and I had told no one, and there was no way on this earth Mara could have known I carried that same sentence in my chest unless Della had truly, truly said it, unless every word of that paper was as real as the rain on the roof. I looked at Elias. He had both hands over his mouth. He was not making a sound. And the third thing was the one that took the whole room down to nothing. Mara's voice changed on the last part. It went softer and slower, and she looked up from the paper more than she looked at it, because I think she'd read it to herself so many times over that year that she had it by heart and only held the page for the town's sake, so they'd believe. "To my husband Elias," she read. Elias made a sound then, a small, broken one. "You are going to blame yourself. I know you. You're going to spend the rest of your life counting up all the ways you think you failed me, the horse you sold, the doctor you couldn't afford, the night the baby came and there was nothing either of us could do. You're going to lie awake and count them like fence posts, over and over, trying to find the one you set wrong." The church did not breathe. "There isn't one. You didn't set a single one wrong. I was tired, Elias, tired in a place you couldn't reach and couldn't mend, and I stopped fighting a long time before the fever, and that was mine to do and none of it was yours. You were the one who kept fighting for me. You were the last light in the window. When they tell you that you dragged me down, and they will tell you, my father will make sure of it. I need you to have this paper, so you'll know that the only thing that ever dragged at me was the weight of pretending, in my father's house, to be a daughter who'd been rescued instead of a woman who'd been sold." Mara paused, turned the page over. There was a little more. "The land I don't care about. Let him have his dirt if it means that much to him. But the truth I care about, and the truth is yours, and I'm giving it to the one person in this county who my father can't buy and can't frighten, because she's already survived worse than anything he could do, and she'll keep it safe until the day you're ready to be found. Trust her, Elias. She held my hand when everyone else was lying to me. She's the bravest person I ever knew. Take the truth, leave them the dirt. You're Della. Nobody moved, and then everybody moved at once. I won't try to describe the noise. Somebody's chair went over. Vesta Ashford was on her feet screaming that it was lies, forgery, the spite of a savage woman. She used the word, and Lord, it landed in that church like a slap, and I watched maybe a dozen faces that had been on her side 1 hour before turn away from her in shame, because they'd all thought worse than that word about Mara for years, and here she was having just handed them a dead girl's soul in her own 2 open hands. Cornelius Ashford tried to speak over it. He was good, I'll grant the devil that he was very good, and for a few sentences it almost worked, all about grief and forgery and a woman's cunning. But then Etta Foss, the washerwoman, stood up in the back and said in a voice that shook but did not stop, "I saw her sign it, Cornelius. I stood right there. And I'll say so to the circuit judge, and so will Pete, and you can't buy the both of us because you never once thought us worth the buying." And old Pete beside her just nodded, 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 and that nodding was somehow the loudest thing in the room. The doctor's paper, the one declaring Della unsound, Mara had that too. Della had gotten it out of her father's desk the same day she found the note, and given it to Mara with everything else. So there it was, in Cornelius Ashford's own file, a document he'd paid for and hidden, proof that he'd tried to have his own daughter declared mad so he could steal from her husband. That's the thing that finished him, not the letter. The town might have argued about a letter. But a man doesn't forge a paper against himself. That doctor's affidavit could only have come from one place, and everyone in that church knew it. The sheriff, who'd come to arrest Mara for fraud, spent that afternoon instead in a very different kind of conversation with the circuit court. You want to know what happened after? I'll tell you, though the after is smaller than the moment, the way it always is. Elias got the land back. It took the better part of a year and a circuit judge and lawyers I didn't know Elias could afford, until I learned Mara had been quietly keeping the fee money aside too, a little at a time, out of nothing, because Della had asked her to. The Ashford's note was thrown out as fraud. The doctor lost his license. Cornelius Ashford didn't go to jail, men like him rarely do, but he lost the thing that had always mattered more to him than freedom, which was the town's belief that he was a good man. He and Vesta sold the house within 2 years and moved on to some other place where the story hadn't reached yet. I heard he died out east. I didn't count the days. Elias moved back onto the Wintergrass place. Ran it another 30 years. He never married again, and he never let anyone tell that story wrong in his hearing, and every spring he walked the fence line down to the creek and back, touching the top of each post with 2 fingers, 211 of them, but he told me once, years on, that it felt different now. Before, I was counting to find the one I set wrong, he said. Now I'm just counting to say hello to her. She held every one of them plumb, you know. Whole fence is half hers. And Mara. Here's the part I've carried the longest. Here's why I couldn't ever tell this story right until now. After the church emptied out that day, after the shouting and the sheriff and Elias on his knees in the front pew with the letter pressed to his face, I went and found her, standing outside in the rain, alone, the way she'd come in. And I asked her. I finally asked her the question this whole town should have asked her 30 years before. "What's your name?" I said. "Your real one, the name they didn't give you." She looked at me a long moment, rain coming down between us, and she told me. I'm not going to write it here, not because I've forgotten it, I never once forgot it. I said it to myself every day for the rest of my life like a penance, but because it was hers, and she gave it to me and not to the town, and the town spent 30 years not deserving to hear it. Some things a man is allowed to keep. Some things aren't a story's to spend. I asked her the other thing too, why she did it. Why a woman with every reason to let Red Hawk Bend drown in its own lies would walk up that street and risk everything for a dead girl and a broken cowboy who couldn't pay her a cent.